Got it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the May meeting for the UTBA. We've got a lot of interesting information. I know I have my pen and paper ready to take some notes. We're going to start off with our Beekeepers Calendar by Marion Whittam.
Thank you, Lucy. This is the Beekeepers Calendar for Toronto and the GTA. And this evening, I just want to make you aware there are some wonderful references out there that I have used to put together this presentation. And it's basically, let me go backwards, sorry. It's the Ontario Beekeepers Association references. They have a great spring checklist. They have information on antibiotic access resources for beekeepers. They have a spring colony management reference source, and also honeybee pests and diseases. So I strongly encourage you to take a look at those. They're fabulous online resources readily available. The other thing is that there are some classic books that I tend to use a fair amount. One of them is Dewey Cairns and Honeybee Biology, Story's Guide to Keeping Bees, and our Tech Transfer Center's Integrated Pest Management Manuals. A reminder also that there are a lot of online videos to view. The University of Guelph Honeybee Research Center has over 60 YouTube videos on resources for beekeepers, so keep that in mind. I'm very pleased to let you know that our UTBA Beekeeper Calendar for Toronto and GTA is now available. And you can get that copy of that posted on our website in the Beekeeping Resources section and can download it free of charge. Also, if you're a paid member, you will be eligible to receive a free printed copy of this calendar, and you will either be able to drop into the Canadian Beekeeping Supply website, or there will be a unique code sent to our members by email. Our calendar is 24 pages of beekeeping resource that can be downloaded. It contains information about monthly tasks to perform indoors and in the apiary, the climate data for Toronto and the GTA, flowers in bloom each month, as well as beautiful pictures of the bees and bee yards. In addition, the final page of our calendar gives information about urban beekeeping and also references about beekeeping videos, blogs, websites, and books. A very good resource to have on hand. Just to let you know too, that there are some online courses if you want to learn more or take a refresher. One of them is Apiology 101 by the Ontario Beekeepers Association, the online introductory bee course, and the second one, Apiology 101 online integrated pest management for beekeeping. The cost is $85. The sessions run once a month for 2 weeks. And one thing that I also find really helpful is that the Tech Transfer Center, the OBA TTP, has an Instagram account for Ontario OBA Tech Transfer Stations, and they give the bee lessons. They tend to have hints and information. It tends to come out every Wednesday as I see it on Instagram. And also a reminder about the OBA TTP Spring Beekeeping Workshops for 2022. They are very pleased to be able to be back in person this year versus doing virtual. I'd suggest you check the OBA website for locations and cost per person. And I know there was one last weekend. There are several other dates throughout the season. And there are 3 courses being offered: Introduction to Beekeeping, Pest Management, and Queen Rearing. So now that it's May, it's time to really get serious about bees and your bee yard, except that what's been happening with our weather is it's very unstable. So we have to be very careful if we decide to open a hive, that the temperature is right. In other words, they say a minimum of 10 degrees centigrade. I think a little bit higher than that is better, probably at 12 or 13. And it's sunny and not windy. But anyway, You can still go into your bee yard. You can clean up your bee yard. You can post your OMAFRA registration if you have not already done so, and start to inspect your hives. And the thing is very important when you're inspecting your hives every time, but especially now too, is to keep notes and take pictures. And one of the things I see on a lot of the Facebook pages is, what do I do in certain situations? And so our Tech Transfer Center on the checklist has offered us some really valuable information, and I'm going to go over some of that tonight with you. Observations when you're opening your hives. What do you do? If your colony doesn't have a queen and there's no sign of disease, they say to shake the bees off the frames into a healthy queen-right colony. If the colony has a queen, but is weak with 1 or 2 frames, find that queen and then reduce a double hive to single if you can. Reposition the frames so the food and honey are close to the brood nest. Increase the population by shaking nurse bees and workers found on brood frames from another strong, healthy colony. Leave the covers on to keep the colony warm. If the colony has a queen and 3 to 5 frames of bees, and the queen is laying well, and that means lots of larvae, lots of eggs, lots of capped brood, the hives should be able to build up and grow. Reposition the frames so the food frames are located near the brood nest, and make sure there's enough honey stores, and if not, supplement with 1-to-1 sugar syrup for now. The dandelions are coming out, and usually you don't supplement much after dandelion season, but dandelions aren't that nutritious for the bees, and also this hive is starting to wanted to build up. If the colony has a queen and is strong with 5 or more frames, remove the entrance reducers. Make sure the queen has enough space to lay. Watch the colony expand. Prepare to add your supers or split. Len's going to talk about splitting later in our presentation. Add the honey supers when the bees have covered 7 of the 10 frames with eggs, larvae, and brood. And remember that strong colonies will also have higher varroa mite levels. So varroa mite monitoring is a priority, and the mite treatments should be done if the mite levels exceed the acceptable spring threshold. So take a look to make sure that you know what the spring's thresholds is versus the fall ones. Then you have to decide, are you going to try and capture a swarm this year, should it happen? And if you do, then you need to you might review a swarm capture video and decide. And determining if a split may be necessary, Alin, as I said, is going to give us more information about this topic in the main session of the meeting. A lot of us, there's a lot of bear activity around. It doesn't have to be in the country. It can be in the city. It can be close to the city with a lot of the redevelopment and movement of wildlife all around the province. So if you do have a bear fence, make sure that it's working properly. Decide if you want to use queen excluders. Do the mite counts and treat per the guidelines, and spring clean your hives. And that means scrape the debris from the bottom boards, the burr comb off the inner covers, the sides of the boxes, and the top bar. Remove and replace 1 or 2 2 dark frames from each hive. And just to let you know that the wax in these frames, when they're old frames, contain spores and may have some chemical residues. So insert your new frames and print the year on the frames so that they can be spotted for the fall, spotted, and follow the OBA on Instagram for helpful weekly hints throughout the season. One thing I want to remind you as the spring comes forward is that Lyme disease is very prominent in Ontario. I have looked up to see if they have the 2022 map yet on this Ontario site, but they don't. So I have given you the 2021 one, and you can see it's very, very widespread. So, you know, these are the habitats where they are, that you could possibly encounter them in any place in Ontario. And online resources, there are lots of great online resources that you should take a look at. One of them is Protect Yourself from Ticks, Bites, and Lyme Disease. And not every tick transmits Lyme disease. That's another thing. So you just have to make sure that you know how to identify the ticks and take a look at them. And there's a really neat application now called eTick app. And you can just, you know, take a photo of the tick, take a look at it, then you can go to that site and do some comparisons. And also Toronto Public Health has a great wellness information about the ticks themselves. And in Toronto, there are ticks in the Rouge and various other areas, and they have been spotted. So I strongly suggest that you do that and do some homework and make sure that you are observant after you've come out of your bee yards and not have any ticks on you. And that's the end of my story for this month. And I hope everyone will be well. Back to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Marion. That was a lot of information to take in today, for sure. I'm excited to get out into my bee yard. Next up, we have Glenys Robinson from the Tech Transfer Program at the OBA. Glenys Robinson is a research technician with the OBA Tech Transfer Program. She fell in love with bees while doing her undergrad at the University of Guelph, where she studied international development, specializing in rural and agricultural development. After graduating, she decided to dive into beekeeping headfirst and took the commercial beekeeping program at Marion. And she's here to talk to us about all the losses that have happened in Ontario with our bees. Welcome, Glynis.
Great, thank you, Lucy. Let me just share my screen here for a second. Oh my gosh, sorry, I have so many tabs open. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, sorry everyone. Yes, hi, I am Glenys, and I am happy to be here tonight to talk about a very unhappy topic, but an important one nonetheless. So we are going to talk about some of the most common causes of overwinter colony mortality in Ontario, how to kind of identify what's going on, how to assess your colonies a little bit, and things like that. So before we get started, just so probably everyone knows who we are, but just so we're all on the same page, I work for the Ontario Beekeepers Association Tech Transfer Program. So we are basically the Ontario Beekeepers Association's field team. And there are kind of three main points to what we do. So the first is we do research. We do research that benefits the beekeeping industry as a whole, usually around, honeybee health, pests and diseases, that kind of thing. We collaborate with different universities, and we also just do some stuff on our own. We also do extension work. So we share the results of this research as well as other best management practices with Ontario's beekeepers. So we do workshops, we do talks like this, and all kinds of things like that. And the last thing that we do is we facilitate the Orbs breeding program. I think we have at least a couple of Orbs breeders in this group on this call right now, so that's great. So Orbs is Ontario's collective breeding program. There are over 30 breeders all over Ontario, and what we do at Tech Transfer is we go out and perform third-party testing on their colonies, looking specifically for a genetic trait called hygienic behavior. And hygienic behavior, it makes bees more resistant to brood diseases. So very important. Yeah, so without further ado, let us dive in and talk about colony losses. So overwinter colony losses are an unfortunate reality of beekeeping. They are something that beekeepers have to work to avoid, but be prepared for, because they do happen. So just for a little bit of background context, OMAFRA, so the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, every year they survey a selection of registered beekeepers in Ontario, and based on the results of those surveys, they estimate Ontario's total overwinter mortality rate. So for last winter, for 2020 to 2021, the overwinter mortality rate was 18%. So that means that they estimated that 18% of all registered colonies in Ontario died that winter. So this year, that survey, it's probably going on right now. We're ramping up right now. The results of it aren't out yet, so we don't have any official numbers yet. That usually happens a little bit later in the summer, once they've had time to collect that data and sort it and write up a report and all that good stuff. But we are predicting, and now that it's getting warmer, we are hearing that it is definitely a bad year for overwinter colony losses. It's kind of all over the news right now. People are posting on social media. There's been news articles about it. I think the OBA president, Bernie Wheely, gave an interview on CBC today that you could check out if you're interested in that. But it's definitely a hot topic right now. It was definitely quite the tough winter. So what was driving these losses? So to put it simply, 2021 was a really bad year for varroa mites. So varroa mites, they have these kind of annual seasonal fluctuations in terms of their populations. So it's kind of like with rabbits. Some year you'll have, a year with a ton of rabbits. It's a booming rabbit year. You'll see rabbits everywhere, and that colony kind of has a bit of a boom bust cycle. So you won't see as many rabbits kind of the next year around. It's kind of like that. And there are a couple of different factors that influence this population cycle with varroa mites, and we're going to talk about those tonight. So the first factor that we're going to talk about is the weather. So last spring of 2021 was really, really early. It was really warm early. The trees and everything were flowering really early. And that meant that colonies, they were rearing brood much earlier in the season. They were kind of a few weeks ahead of schedule than normal. And we're going to kind of dive in and talk about the nitty gritty of how that turned into a bad varroa year in a minute. So hang on to that idea of an early spring last year. But I do kind of want to backtrack a bit and say that varroa mites might not be the first thing that you think about when you think about overwinter problems with your colonies, but actually research by Dr. Guzman at the University of Guelph has found that varroa mites are the #1 cause of overwinter colony losses in Ontario. So whether it's a bad varroa year or not, they are going to be the #1 force driving colony losses here in Ontario. And I did put the title of that research if anyone wants to check it out. It's really informative and local to Ontario, which is great. So we're going to get into how that early spring impacted varroa levels. But before we do that, just to make sure everyone is on the same page, we are going to take a second to understand how varroa mites reproduce. So we're going to look at the varroa mite life cycle. So it starts off with a female mite who is also called the foundress mite. She will sneak into a brood cell right before it gets capped over, and she'll kind of hide in the food and debris and stuff at the bottom of the cell until it gets capped over. And then once it gets capped over, she will come out of hiding. She will start feeding on that pre-pupa in that cell, and she will also start laying eggs. So the first egg that she lays is always going to be a male, and then every egg that she lays after that is always going to be female. So once those eggs hatch, they will also join their mother in feeding on that pupa. The new females will mate with that male mite who's in there. There's a lot of inbreeding that goes on in varroa mite populations. And then when the adult bee when the pupa is fully developed, once it's an adult, it will emerge, and any mature female mites who are in the cell, they will emerge with it. So any mature females, they will leave the cell with the bee and they will go find a new cell to jump into and start the process all over again. The male mite and any immature mites, so any female mites who haven't yet reached sexual maturity, they will stay in the cell and they will die. Another thing to be aware of is that varroa mites are definitely more attracted to drone brood than worker brood. And the reason for that is because drones take about 3 days longer than worker bees to develop. And those 3 days are in the pupal stage. So that means that the varroa mites have those extra 3 days to feed on the bee to fully develop. And that means that in drone brood, you'll actually have more female mites survive to adulthood, and then more who exit the cell and go on to infest other cells. So to get specific about it, and sorry if you took our Train the Trainer program, I did steal some of these slides from those presentations, so a little review here. But to get really specific about numbers here, in worker brood, one female mite will produce 1 to 2 daughters who survive into adulthood. And in drone brood, one female mite will have 2 to 3 daughters who survive till adulthood. And also, not only will her daughters leave the cell and go infest other cells, but that first female mite, the foundress mite, she will also leave and go infest other cells. So she is not limited to one reproductive cycle. She has on average 3 to 4 reproductive cycles in her lifetime. So if you look at the highest possible average numbers, that means that one female mite can produce up to 12 daughters, and then each of those daughters can then have 12 daughters of her own. So that is a ton of offspring coming from one mite, one organism, especially if you think of all of the daughters and granddaughters that she's producing. So varroa mite populations, the most key thing to understand about them is that they actually grow exponentially. So they just kind of snowball. The longer, like the more time that passes, the more varroa mites you will have in a colony. So tying it back to that early winter, that early spring, not early winter, when brood rearing started a few weeks early, that gave the varroa mites a head start. It gave them longer to reproduce. And then because their populations grow exponentially, you ended up with much more mites earlier in the season. And then, of course, the more mites that you have in a colony, the more damage you are going to see to the bees. So basically, that early spring gave the mite population time to get really out of control and also to reach that critical threshold of damage earlier in the season. So the first factor that affects these annual varroa mite population cycles is the weather and when brood rearing can start, so that early spring. But the second is actually the overwinter mortality rates. And the reason for this is because those overwinter mortality rates, they impact our management practices as beekeepers. So for example, in a year where we had really high overwinter losses like this year, what everyone does is they go and split their colonies really, really intensely in order to recoup their losses. And splitting colonies is actually a way to slow varroa mite population growth. So it's kind of a cultural management practice that can slow that varroa mite reproduction down. But the reverse is also true in years where winter losses are low. When we have a good winter, people aren't splitting as heavily in the spring, which means that varroa populations are able to grow higher throughout the season, and then that often leads to high losses the next winter. So just to give you an idea of this, this graph is showing the overwinter mortality trends from 2010 to 2013. So 2010, it really paralleled what happened last year in 2021. We had a really early spring and a ton of brood production early in the season, and that in turn led to high Varroa reproduction. Then that winter of 2010 to 2011, we had really high overwintering mortality, around a 45% loss, which is really, really significant. But then that spring, first of all, it was a later spring, so you didn't have that head start for the mites. And then at the same time, because it was a bad winter, there was a ton of splitting happening in order to recover those losses. So that combined with the late spring led to slower Varroa reproduction. And then that winter, we had a good winter. So we only had a loss of around 15%. But then it's kind of, you see the cycle. In 2012, we had a very early spring with lots of brood production, but because it was a good winter, there wasn't a lot of splitting. So these two factors kind of coupled together to cause high rates of Varroa reproduction. And then again, of course, in 2012 to 2013, we had high overwinter mortality again, around a 45% loss. So you can really see how overwinter mortality and Varroa reproduction, Varroa levels for that season, they really go hand in hand. So I know that that graph kind of makes things seem a little bit inevitable, and that is not what I'm trying to say. So don't worry, I'm not saying that, you know, every other year, depending on the weather and that kind of stuff, your colonies are destined to follow these trends. It's more that understanding these trends helps us to make informed decisions. But the important thing to understand is that those overwinter colony mortality rates, those are at the macro level. Those are the big picture. So that's for all of Ontario. But each of us as beekeepers, we are operating at the micro level. So we are just one part of this big picture. So ultimately, the health and the overwintering success of your colonies is determined by your management practices, what you actually do in your colonies throughout the season and with your winter prep, not these seasonal trends. So this year, you know, we've had really high losses in the province, but at Tech Transfer, we currently have, I think, about 120 colonies, and we only lost 3 colonies over the winter. And I'm not saying that to brag or to make anyone feel bad or anything like that. I just want to give you some hope and reassurance that if you follow best management practices, it is possible to get your bees through these really tough Varroa years. So talking about best management practices, the key ones are all about Varroa, and Varroa always starts with monitoring. So it's really important to be monitoring consistently throughout the season, starting in the spring. You can't wait until the fall to check in and see what's going on. You have to monitor consistently through the season. It's also about applying appropriate chemical treatments when you have reached the treatment threshold, but not just applying them, making sure that you are applying them correctly, that you're following the label, and also that you're applying them early enough. That's really, really important. You don't want to wait until after your Varroa levels have already gotten really high, because at that point they've already done lasting damage to your bees. So even if you treat the Varroa mites, you get rid of the Varroa mites with your chemical treatments, that damage has already been done. So it's really important to stay on top of things and not let it get too late. And also just following best management practices in the fall for feeding and for preparing your bees for winter. So we don't really have time right now to go through all of these best management practices for all of these things. But as Marion already brought up, we do have a ton of free resources available for you. She covered all of them really, but one of the main ones that I want to bring up is that this winter, we actually did a whole series of lectures on Varroa mites. So it covered their impacts in biology. It covered treatments. It covered, oh gosh, I should remember this, resistance behaviors that you can breed for. As well as timing and population dynamics. So if you want to learn more about varroa mites, I would definitely encourage you to check out this series that we did that is on YouTube. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit here because varroa mites aren't the only thing that will potentially kill your colonies over the winter. There are a number of kind of common causes in Ontario. So you can't just assume that they died over the winter, so it was for sure varroa mites, although varroa mites is always a great place to start. That paper by Dr. Guzman that I brought up earlier, it actually found that the second most common cause of overwinter colony losses was weak winter populations. So that means colonies going into winter without enough worker bees. So this is definitely not surprising as a common cause of death because, of course, there's no brood production that's going on over the spring. So what they have is what they've got over the winter. And another thing that's really important to understand is that, sorry, let me organize my thoughts for a second here. Another thing that's really important to understand is that winter bees are actually physiologically different than summer bees. So that means that they have physical differences that allow them to live longer, which is how the colony survives the winter. So summer bees live for a number of weeks and winter bees live for months. So it's a really big difference. And it's really important to be aware of the fact that these really critical winter bees, they are being raised in starting around August. So, you know, at that time of year getting into fall, yes, brood rearing will be dwindling a bit, it will be dying down, but that doesn't mean that it's not important because those are the bees that are really critical for getting you through the winter. So it's really important to make sure that that population is healthy and there are plenty of bees being raised in August, kind of into early September. I think that a lot of beekeepers really kind of underestimate exactly how many bees a colony needs to have going into winter. I think there's a tendency to look and see, you know, a good number of bees and be like, yeah, that's great, that's totally enough. But actually, it's kind of surprising just how many bees they do need. So that same research paper by Dr. Guzman, it found that colonies actually lose an average of 42% of their population by the spring. So bees that are just kind of naturally reaching the end of their lifespan. So if you think about it, the population in the fall going into winter, it has to be big enough that the colony can lose almost half of the population and still make it into spring, and in the spring still have enough workers to go out and start foraging and all of that good stuff. So really don't underestimate how many bees you need going into winter. So what causes these weak populations going into winter is usually another issue happening earlier in the season. So for example, if there was like a prolonged brood break or series of brood breaks because you were having queen issues or tons of late season swarms or things like that. But also pest and disease issues can really impact brood production, especially varroa mites can really impact that brood production. So can kind of see how all these things are kind of interrelated. But yeah, just to emphasize that these colonies are going into winter too weak. They're starting off too weak in the fall. It's not that something happens to the population over the winter and suddenly they all die. It's all about consistently in kind of late summer, early fall, making sure that things are good and those populations are good going into winter. And if they're not, then you can consider combining any weak colonies that you have. Another big factor is starvation. And again, I don't think anyone will be very surprised by this because of course bees can't go and forage in the winter. They're limited to the food stores that they have. Although they are less active in the winter than they are in the summer, they're not hibernating, they are still active, they're doing stuff. In order to get through the winter, what bees do is they form a cluster inside the hive. So they all bunch together in kind of a clump and they continuously vibrate their muscles or shiver. And that is how they generate heat. So in order to do all this exercising that they do all winter, all this vibration of their muscles, they need a lot of food in order to give them that energy. So you do need to make sure that they're going into winter with a good amount of food. And we do have a recommended amount of food that you should be feeding in the fall. You can check out our guide to feeding bees, which is available on our website. But the one thing that I want to say about starvation is that there's actually kind of two different types of starvation. So two different sets of symptoms to look for. So the first is what you would expect, that the colony ran out of food, what you think of when you think of starvation. So if you look at the top picture, you can see all kinds of bees with their heads stuck in the cells and their abdomen sticking out. And this is a classic symptom of starvation. So they all went in the cells to try and get any last little crumbs of food that are in there, and they died while they were in there, and that's how you'll find them in the spring. So that's a very classic symptom to look out for. The second type of starvation is when the colony had enough food stores, but they actually got separated from those food stores. And this is related to extreme cold. So in this case, it's not that they ran out of food, but when it gets really, really cold, the bees have to cluster together very, very tightly, and they can't break that cluster to go and access new food. So if they are very cold and tightly clustered, even if there's other food in the hive, they can't move in order to get to that food. So in this case, you'll see colonies that have the symptoms of starvation, but you still see honey in other frames. So this picture on the bottom isn't the best example because this cluster is so tiny that they wouldn't have been able to generate enough heat anyways. But you can see that on the right there, they do still have honey in the hive. So it's not that they ran out of food, it's that they couldn't access that food because they couldn't move the cluster. Another one to think about, and I think something that people often forget about until it's too late, is moisture. So people are always really, really concerned about the cold going into winter, but bees can actually handle the cold. Well, sorry, a strong, healthy colony of bees can handle the cold really, really well, but they can't handle moisture. So if bees get wet, then they aren't able to regulate their temperatures properly. They have no way to dry off, and they can end up freezing to death if they get wet. So think about how much colder you get if you're out and your hair's wet or your clothes are wet. It's the same thing, but they can't go and get a towel and dry off. So you don't want what we have in that top picture there, where a yard is very nice and dry in the summer when you move in, and then in the spring you find out that is actually a puddle at the bottom of a valley. So you want to avoid that. But kind of more of what we talk about with moisture is actually moisture building up inside the hive. So as bees eat and as they breathe, they actually release water vapor. So they're just constantly releasing water vapor. And this can actually build up as condensation on the underside of the inner cover. And then if there's too much condensation building up, it'll drip back down onto the cluster. And then of course, if they get wet, they can't regulate their temperature properly and they will die. So it's really important that we make sure that we have space for the air to flow right up in that problem area where that condensation is gathering. So in the winter, we really, really recommend that you have a top entrance to allow that moisture to kind of exit the hive right up where the problem is. And of course, if you have a top entrance, don't cover it up with your wrap. Make sure that your wrap also has a hole in it to allow that moisture to exit. This is not the most pleasant one, but it's an important one to talk about. So dysentery is basically bee diarrhea. So someone is currently eating, and I'm talking about dysentery, sorry about that. But it can be caused by a number of different things, but the most common cause of dysentery is poor quality feed. So what that means is feed that has a high moisture content, which can cause it to ferment. Or if you have, old fermented syrup that you feed to your bees, that can also lead to dysentery. But also it can mean feed that has lots of unrefined sugars. So that means things like brown sugar or coconut sugar or any kind of, kind of sugar that you would find in like the healthy aisle of the grocery store, as well as actually fall honey. So that is something to be aware of if all your bees have to eat over winter is fall honey. All of these things, these unrefined sugars, fall honeys, they all contain indigestible compounds. So these compounds are just really hard on the bees' stomachs. Sorry, my cat is now here and yelling. They're hard on the bees' stomachs. They stress out their digestive systems, and they can lead to dysentery. Another thing that can lead to dysentery is prolonged bad weather. So normally bees won't go to the bathroom inside the hive. They'll leave and go on cleansing flights. But if it is really bad weather for a long time, they won't be able to do this. And when you gotta go, you gotta go. So sometimes they end up going inside the hive. Another thing that you might have heard is that dysentery is a symptom of Nosema. And that is true, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So Nosema is a fungal disease. And there are actually 2 different strains of Nosema in Ontario. So one of these strains is called Nosema apis, and the other is Nosema ceranae. Now, studies have found that Nosema ceranae is the more prevalent strain in Ontario, but it's Nosema apis, so the less prevalent strain, that causes dysentery. So dysentery is not a symptom of Nosema ceranae, which is the more common one. So it is much more likely that if you're seeing dysentery, it's been caused by poor feed compared to Nosema. But talking about Nosema, is Nosema a common cause of overwinter deaths? It's possible for Nosema to cause overwinter colony losses, but it's, again, not very likely. It's more commonly seen with Nosema apis, which again is the less prevalent one, so less common to see it as a cause of overwinter death. Nosema is usually more of a spring issue. So Nosema, it follows kind of a seasonal cycle, and a strong, healthy colony, it may see Nosema peak a bit in the spring, but by fall, a strong, healthy colony should be able to kind of deal with the Nosema issue on their own. So you aren't as likely to see it in the winter. But that being said, Nosema is a stress-related disease. So often you see it if your bees are experiencing other stressors. So that could be related to poor feed or a lack of feed or other pest or disease issues, queen issues, anything like that. So Nosema is kind of better to think of as an indicator of other stressors. It's usually not a standalone issue. Actually, when you are most likely to see to see Nosema is kind of right now in the spring. So the main symptom that you can look for with Nosema is a slow spring buildup. So if you know that you have a queen and she's laying okay, but the population just doesn't seem to be building up and you're not sure why, that is a red flag for Nosema. So long story short, Nosema is more of a spring issue than a winter issue. Okay, so switching gears here to kind of the spring, when we're getting out there and opening up our colonies and taking stock of our losses. What should you do if your colony is dead? It's really important that dead colonies get dealt with as soon as possible. You really don't want to be leaving them out because it will make it a lot harder to determine the cause of death. But it can also be a biosecurity issue. It can be a way that pests and diseases are spread to your other colonies. If you have healthy colonies going in there to rob out the dead colonies to go and steal their resources, that can cause diseases to be spread. So it's really important that you deal with them as soon as possible and cover them up. Seal them up with the entrance reducers and duct tape and that kind of thing if you can't get to them right away, to keep that robbing, especially now that it's getting warmer. But there's still not that much food yet in the environment. Strong colonies are going to be out there trying to get anything they can. So definitely now is the time if you haven't already done that. The most important thing is to try and determine the cause of death. So to try and do a bit of an autopsy. So it was brought up earlier, but we do have a spring checklist to try and help you through this process. You can take it with you to the bee yard and it'll show you the most common symptoms of all of these common issues that we talked about. So it can help guide you through that process. Another thing that you want to do before you reuse any of that equipment is make sure that there's no signs of brood diseases. So notably American foul brood, but also European foul brood. Even Nosema can be spread through contaminated equipment when you're reusing it. So if you're not seeing any signs of brood disease, then it should be good to reuse. If there's dead bees on it, then you can just kind of scrape them off into a nice sealed garbage bin or a burn barrel, something like that. Don't just leave them sitting in your yard. But other than that, you should be good to go. Yes, so this is another reminder about that, about that checklist. So this is kind of what it looks like. And again, you can find it on our website. If you go to ontariobee.com and then outreach and then tech transfer and then fact sheets and publications, that's where you find all of these resources under our fact sheets and publications. So just to end off here, I really want to say that I know if you lose your colonies, it's really frustrating and it feels really terrible, especially if it came as a surprise and you felt like you did everything right and they were going into winter looking really good. But don't let that discourage you from learning and from getting to the bottom of what happened. Beekeeping is for sure a really steep learning curve, so it's especially frustrating for beginners, but I mean, it's frustrating for everyone. But just a few little kind of, I don't know, tricks to get you started on your learning journey here. Stick with Ontario specific resources. So our resources or the University of Guelph or OMAFRA, the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture. Even if you're looking at credible resources that are from other places, they may not be very applicable to Ontario. So for example, the University of Florida, they do great research. It's a great organization, but beekeeping in Florida is very different than beekeeping in Ontario. Again, Marion brought this up earlier, but make sure that you keep really great records because you want to be able to have something to go back to in the spring if you do run into issues, so that you can look back on what you did throughout the season and see if there are any kind of indicators or warning signs or things to consider like that. I know we always think that we're going to remember, but by the time the winter is past, you are not going to remember exactly what was going on in your hives, especially specific Varroa counts. So that is an important one. And then one last little reminder is that Tech Transfer does offer an in-person and virtual pest management workshop. So if you are feeling really overwhelmed thinking about these losses or about what you're going to do about Varroa mites this spring, then I would definitely recommend that you check that out. And one last thing, we are so close to being out of the danger zone, but we're not quite there yet, as was brought up earlier. Usually in terms of feed, in terms of making sure that your bees have enough food stores, once the dandelions are fully in bloom, that's usually considered out of the danger zone. But I'm seeing some dandelions, but I don't think it's quite, that huge bloom quite yet. So just be aware in the spring of how much feed they have left. Go out and feel your hives, do the heft test, make sure that they have enough food. And then as well, people really like to take their wraps off really early, like really dangerously early. Usually the first nice day of the spring, we see everyone on Instagram making a video of them taking the wraps off. And I really encourage you not to do that. At Tech Transfer, our wraps are definitely still on, and they will be on until it is consistently above 0 degrees overnight for at least a week. There's really no rush to take those wraps off. Bees can cool things down way easier than they can heat things up. And the spring is a really, really vulnerable time because they're starting brood production again, which means that they actually have to keep the hive even warmer, which means they need to eat more. So you can see how all these issues kind of blend together, but a really easy thing that you can do to keep them safe is leave those wraps on. Yes, that is pretty much everything I want to say right now. I know that was a lot of information, but I would be happy to take questions if we have any questions.
There's a question in the chat. Glynis, if you want to take a look at that, and then anybody else, please just put your questions in the chat and Glynis can answer them.
Chat. Just give me a second. Second type of starvation. Do you see this more in doubles than singles? My experience is I see this more with doubles than singles. Honestly, at Tech Transfer, we don't run doubles, so I can't give a great answer to this question. I wouldn't be surprised because there's a lot more space, a lot more frames for the bees to kind of get separated from that feed. If they end up in one corner and then you have feed left or food stores left in another corner, I can definitely see how they might be a bit more likely. But in general, it's definitely something to watch out for in singles or doubles. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised about maybe a little more prevalent in doubles. What would be the signs of AFB in a winter deadout? So they would be the normal signs that you would be looking for at any time of the year. So definitely do more research than what I'm about to tell you right now. If you're not familiar with the signs of AFB, it is so important that you're able to recognize it, especially early on. Again, AFB, if you aren't familiar, is the one where you have to euthanize your bees and burn your equipment if you do have a positive case. So you really want to catch these issues early before they spread. But the signs that you should be looking for, the biggest one is scale inside of the cells. So you'll kind of see this like brown, dried out, tough little thing. So what happens is the brood that is developing in the cells, it basically starts to like decay. It starts to kind of melt and turn to goop. And then that goop, it settles as a scale. So you have to look in like the bottoms of the cells for this scale. Definitely look at pictures if you have no idea what I'm talking about right now. It's also good to be looking out for if there's any brood left in your dead out. You definitely want to open that up with a hive tool or your fingernail and take a look at what's going on inside, because that is the stage where AFB will attack the brood, is the pupal stage where it's capped. So you want to be aware of that. And in normal colonies, you want to be looking for any signs of chewing on the capping. So if there's little holes in the cappings, or if the cappings are sunken or greasy looking, these are all symptoms of AFB. So checking out the brood for sure. Can you elaborate a bit about beekeeping in Florida versus Ontario? Honestly, I don't have a lot of great specifics. I've never done any beekeeping in Florida, but the point of that example is just like for varroa mites in particular, in Florida, they don't have a winter brood break the same way that we do here. So that really impacts their seasonal varroa cycles as well as their management for varroa. So that is something to bear in mind. Like some things, a queen is a queen in Florida the same way it is in Ontario, but things that are more impacted by the weather and the temperature and that kind of thing, like varroa mite populations, those are impacted. If you are running singles, how many frames of bees do you want to go into winter with? As many as possible. I don't know if we have a magic number for that. It's getting late. Things are kind of falling out of my brain. I will double check if we have a magic number and I will share that with you. But in general, as many frames as possible for sure. We had an issue with our bees collecting lots of nectar in late summer, early fall, but did not seem to cap it effectively. So we think moisture in the hives was a problem as well as the quality of the feed. So this is actually like the same problem. So one of the low quality feeds that you can have is a feed with high moisture, like in this case where it hasn't been capped properly. That is usually, sorry, I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. So if your bees are not taking down, no, I'm going to start in a different place. So we really recommend feeding bees in the fall, feeding them sugar syrup in the fall as like a supplemental feed so that they're not just relying on what they are finding in the environment, because of course it can vary with what's going on with the weather, what's in bloom, that kind of thing.
Can you define fall here? Like November-ish?
No, in November they shouldn't really be flying, and they definitely won't be taking anything down. And there won't be anything in. Sorry, there's a lot of questions happening at once. So bees will not fly when it's below 10 degrees. So even if there's things in the environment, or if you have feed out in the environment, they won't fly to go get it below 10 degrees. So it's not really a calendar date thing, it's a temperature thing. But as well, once you get below that 10 degrees, they also will not be able to be making food stores. They won't be able to cure the nectar or the syrup that you're giving them and get that moisture level down so that they can cap it over. So it really is about getting them fed before temperatures are getting below that 10-degree mark. Going back to this moisture and feed question, it's kind of tricky to answer this because sometimes the issue with this is just temperature. But sometimes the issue with this is that the colony was kind of weak in the fall, and that's why they weren't able to get through that work of creating these fall food stores. What can be done to improve quality of the feed? Like I said, we really, really recommend feeding them sugar syrup in the fall. A lot of people don't like the idea of feeding sugar because it seems, less natural, and because sugar isn't very healthy for humans. But in the fall specifically, sugar, and what we recommend is white refined sugar, so just normal table sugar. It doesn't contain any of those indigestible compounds that I was talking about. Because it's refined, it's really, really pure. So it's the easiest things for them to digest. It's the least likely thing to cause dysentery over the winter. So in the fall specifically, sugar, white refined sugar, is actually the best thing that you can give them to help them get through the winter.
I'm just to kind of, because all those suggestions, those are all, it's kind of interesting because we've kept bees in the city and we've moved the bees, and the bees are up at our cottage, and there's a huge body of water there, and it's fairly kind of damp. Would the amount of kind of moisture in the environment impact that as well?
Yeah, for sure. Like if there's a lot of moisture in the air, that'll be kind of more of an issue than like moisture in the feed is kind of a different issue than moisture in terms of not being able to regulate temperature than I was talking about, like if that makes any sense. But definitely if you are in a wet area, then that will definitely impact your moisture levels. So be extra sure that you are have lots of ventilation, that you're putting in upper entrances, that those upper entrances aren't covered by the wraps, all that kind of stuff.
Okay, so I mean, it seems like the thing probably to really keep in mind is also to just feed a lot earlier if we are going to
yes
feed. Because these bees are also farther north too, in terms of just the temperatures and all of that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, it took me a while to like circle around to all these points, but I think we got there in the end. Old research in Ontario recommended 8 frames of bees to overwinter a single. Under good conditions, you can overwinter 5 frames of bees in a single with extra good insulation. Yeah, that sounds about right to me for sure. But again, just as many as possible. And if you're kind of questioning it, if you're like, are they kind of weak? That probably means that they might be a little bit too weak. Another good indicator that they are too weak is, like I said, if you're feeding and they aren't really doing a great job of taking down that feed, that is a good indication that the worker population is not kind of where it needs to be. I left my hives with a medium of honey and they still starved. I think the temperature really needs to be looked at, as sometimes we've had warmer temperatures into November and December. Yeah, for sure. So it's kind of a balancing act, because really, really cold is really hard for them, but also if it's warm or if it's fluctuating, then they end up being more active, which means that they end up eating more food. So that is definitely something to bear in mind. Yes, that is what I want to say about that.
Okay, I think that's the end of the questions. Thank you for all of that information. It was really, really good, and I'm sure it'll help everybody as we start to go in our hives, sort of figure things out. We are going to take a 10-minute break. It's 7:32, so we'll be back at 7:42, and we will be having Alin talk to us about splitting. So we will see you at 7:42. Thanks.
Have we heard from Alin?
Yeah, I'm here.
You're back.
Yeah, there's nobody trapped inside and the fire was put down. So we're waiting for the fire truck.
Wow.
Alrighty.
Well, they're still waiting for the fire truck.
Yeah, there was an old lady, like she doesn't even speak English that well. So, but we took her out and I searched every room. So there's nobody left. And she said there's nobody left in the house. It's just smoke. I think it was her stove. So, but yeah, anyway, she begged anybody she could meet or see, you know, to try to help her. So we're good. So how do I share screen here?
It's down at the bottom. I'm just going to introduce you.
Yeah.
Alin
Alrighty.
has been keeping bees since 2016. He is a breeder with the Orbs program since 2018. His business is Northumberland Bees, and he manages approximately 200 hives and is mainly focused on queen and Nook production. Alin, it's at the bottom of your screen. It's a green button.
Right. Okay. Do let me know if it's visible.
There you go. You're up.
Alrighty. All right, so today we're going to talk about splits. So after such Canadian winters, every spring we're looking so eagerly to see either the first pollen, the first flowers, first eggs, larvae, and brood, you know, at the time when we can do an inspection. And then, of course, first honey supers going on the hive. So such an excitement for us to be able to witness these after so long, you know, away from the bees. We're also happy to see the bees have survived, but with this comes the natural process of swarming. And even though we're trying so hard to prevent swarming, the reality is swarming is a natural, healthy process, a very good process for the bees. It's how they reproduce. And sometimes the swarming divides a colony in two, but we know that sometimes you know, bees swarm even more times. Sometimes the virgin queens would take like a second or third split, like a swarm, and you know, go away. And we're talking about splits because, sorry, we're talking about the swarming because with the splits we're trying to mimic a swarm, right? We're trying to give them all the conditions to the bees that they work in our favor. And we're gonna go through the factors that favor swarming, because basically these are gonna kind of like hint to us the timing of splits, right? So one of the first factor is congestion and the colony size. So at the point where there's a lot of bees, they start thinking, oh, maybe we should, you know, gather our queen and leave. The next one would be temperature. And within the last 2 years, the first very warm Saturday of May, we got reports and calls at the shop about lots of swarms. It's like I'm almost waiting for the first warm Saturday in this May to see swarms around our neighborhood. Brood nest size. So another factor that bees take into consideration for swarming is the size of the brood nest and the composition, like the actual pheromones that the larvae emit, right, would hint the bees about timing and so. And it's also the queen pheromone. As the nests get congested and there's a lot of bees, less and less of the pheromone gets circulated around, and then it helps the bees in making the decision. And also resources. So they do count on resources to be available for them to build a new nest. So along the years, they've adapted to read the signs of nature and then understand when it would be optimal for them to leave so that they have higher chances of survival, right? There's an approximation. An average swarm contains a queen and then 12,000 bees. Now, if you pay a bit of attention, this almost translates to 2 frames full of brood. It's like 3,500 per side on a frame. So that kind of gives us a hint on like a minimum size for a split to make. Yeah, so as beekeepers, we simulate a swarm by making these splits. And we're going to talk about the following types of splits. Splits to make new colonies, to make like nooks or so that will grow into a full colony by the end of the season. Splits that we make just for mating nooks. Splits that we make for swarm prevention, not necessarily because we want to increase, but because we're kind of like forced to do it. And then a special method where we don't need to find the queen, I guess promoted by Mr. Doolittle. Yeah, so first item is splitting to start a new colony. And first we're going to talk about splitting into nooks. And usually here in Ontario, we see the 4 or 5 frame nooks, which could resemble the ones you see on the stands. Then we're going to talk a bit about splitting using regular size equipment, whether it's 8 or 10 frames. So nooks are the best way for beginner beekeepers to start keeping bees. And the reason for that is that it has been hopefully made by an experienced beekeeper. And the new beekeeper, all she has to do is transfer the nook into a new home. No worries about the queen acceptance, because that's already been done by the beekeeper that assembled the split. And the new beekeeper has to make sure that there's enough space to grow. So it's kind of like an easy way into starting beekeeping, right? Before we're gonna dive into the methods of splitting, we're gonna look a bit on the Ontario Bee Breeders Association standard recipe for a nook. So first we should have a laying queen, not just a queen, but ideally a laying queen that has been accepted, not still in a cage. And they're saying 2 frames of brood, and out of those brood, half to 2/3 should be kept with the adhering bees. And then 1 frame of feed also with the bees. In the case where we want to go to like a 5 framer, then it would be 3 frames of brood, 1 frame of feed, and then either empty comb or foundation. Also, to give them more chances of growing, surviving, and so on, extra bees can be shaken into the splits. But we're going to talk a bit about this just a bit later. The actual technique, so we're going to talk about the technique now. The goal is to create a small colony with 3-4 frames of brood and 1 frame of feed. So basically, this is how we go about this. So first of all, we're going to prepare the equipment where the Nook is going to live, right? This could be, let me just move this guy away. So in terms of Nooks in Ontario, we may see them like in these 1-piece plastic boxes, 2-piece plastic boxes where the lid actually can be completely detached. A 2-piece cardboard box. The wooden ones, not very often, but I guess if you're splitting for yourself, this one is a very good option. So prepare the equipment. And also when we start splitting Nooks, we usually keep a spare box with us. And then when making the split and when we find a queen on a frame in the big colony, we take that frame with the queen and put it in the spare box. So light the smoker, zip the veil to avoid surprises. Then the first step would be open the colony, place the top cover upside down, inner cover goes on top of it, and the spare box would be placed on the inner cover. That's how we work. And just in case, when we put the frame with the queen inside, she drops off the frame, she's within that box on the inner cover, so she won't go away, or she's not in the grass. And then while we move around, moving frames, and so we get to kill the poor queen. And then we're going to start removing the frames from the side of the box. And the purpose of doing that is we're going to try to tag or to categorize the frames. So when we're splitting a larger colony, it may be that we have to go through more than one of the boxes to find the proper frames to remove and to build a new split. So as we go, we're going to check for the drone comb frames, feed frames where we have some or a lot of kept honey. This could be like a frame that half has honey on it and half is just empty cells. Would work because it's going to provide the food, but also the space for the queen to keep laying. Frames with eggs, so we're going to categorize those, but these are not necessarily our a target to be moved to the split. And then the most important, the frames with brood. And here we're going to look for order larvae and kept brood. Sorry. Sorry, my daughter got scared. Okay, so So once we categorized, we can place the frames either in the Nook box to be part of the split. And again, here we're talking about the frames that either have the food, the honey, either contain a large portion with all the larvae and kept brood. The other ones we're going to place in the spare box with the queen, and then later they're going to be returned to the colony. And the frame with the queen, which the queen we will find her usually on the frames with eggs, that will go straight into the spare box. When we have the 3 frames of brood, or 4 frames when we're splitting for a 5 frame, then we're going to shake some more. It's time to shake some more bees. So because now we already have the queen isolated, we know for sure that if we pull new frames from the big colony, we can shake more bees into our split without the risk of, adding the queen as well. And we would prefer to shake young nurse bees so they can tend to the larvae that we just moved in the split. Also, to the younger bees are the ones that they build wax, right? So given that the split will be in expansion mode for quite a while, these will be helping very much with building the new nest, the new frames, the new combs, right? So once we have we have all the frames that we need for the split. So again, we're talking about 3 frames of brood, 3 frames of brood. Then we can add the queen cage. And the queen cage usually should go in an area where there is open brood, so that the bees that tend to those larvae would also tend to the queen. So then we're going to place the lid to close the split. And if we're going to transport it away, then the entrance needs to be blocked, but we need to make sure that there is ventilation. This can be done either with screen that we can staple on the bottom board at the entrance, or in our case, we use these entrance discs, which have like one of the area that covers the entrance that allows ventilation, like allows the air to go in and out, but doesn't allow the bees to get through. So one thing to consider after we made a split, especially in the small colonies, is we need to make sure that they have enough ventilation, but also make sure that there's not too much if there's a small number of bees and it's still cold outside like these days. So we need to basically balance the bees and the ventilation. And sometimes, we add more bees, but then we need to make sure there's a wider area that allows the air flow. Or if we don't want to add too many bees, then maybe we want to like tape some of the screen or so that it's not too cold for them. Once the split is closed, then we're going to put all the frames in from the spare box back into the hive, and we're going to replace those frames. Now, either we have frames with comb that has already been drawn, or brand new frames. And then also we need to make sure now that we reassemble the nest in a way that it's one unit. So basically, in the big colony, we're not going to place empty frames with no comb in between frames of brood just because we took some brood from that position, right? We want to reassemble the hive as a one nest or one piece nest, so that the bees can quickly recover and then keep growing or minding their own business. So we're going to place the frames back, and then we're going to brush all the bees from the inner cover. Always when working with the inner cover, when taking it off and putting it back, take a close look, see if the queen is there, just in case, right? Then place the inner cover back and place the top cover. So these are the steps. And in here, we can kind of see that, like on the left side, there's the parent colony, and ideally it has, the frames of brood on the inside, and then there's the frames of food or just empty comb on the sides. And we're going to place those 3 frames of brood in the split. We're going to place 1 frame of feed. In this case, the picture shows more than 4 or 5 frames, but basically the count is almost the same, right? And then in the parent colony, right, even if there is at this point just a few frames of brood, the bees, the foragers will come back and then strengthen the colony, so they will help with growing back. Now, in this picture on the top right, we can see how the nest was reassembled to be tight. So all the empty frames go on the sides, and the bees, when they're warming the nest, they don't have to warm 2 areas. A few things about the transportation. So we did make the split, and now if the split is going to stay in the same yard, all we need to do is check back in a few days. And if many of the bees, went back to the mother colony, just shake a few frames of bees right by the entrance of the split. The old bees will fly back, but the nurse bees will climb into this split, reinforcing it, right? In case that we need to transport the split away inside a car, then it's recommended the use of air conditioning to help them keep the temperature down. Nooks can overheat very easily, so pay special attention to that. And if we travel with the bees, we need to position the Nook to be parallel with the direction of travel. And this is mainly for the case where the vehicle, stops, then the frames, if they get together, then they won't be squishing the bees. The next method to do the split is the walk away split. Usually we do this when we have large, strong colonies, and I would say not many of them. And then we don't want to bother finding the queen. The pros here are that we don't spend too much time, but the con is that it takes a long time until the new colony has a laying queen. So if all goes well, the way we would do a walkaway split would be for 2-story hives would be prepare the extra bottom board, inner cover and top cover. Open the colony, remove top cover and inner cover. Take the box on top, place it on the new bottom board, simple as that. Place the inner covers on both of the colonies. And if we know which ones of them has less brood and bees, then we can keep that on the old location. The foragers would come back to it. And then we walk away. So basically this is a very simple, basic method of splitting. And in a few days, I would say 4 to 7, we can come back and then we will inspect both of these colonies. For the colony that kept the old queen, it's very easy to figure out which one that is, because it will have lots of eggs in the case we're inspecting, just like say after 4 days. And if it's a week later, then we will see eggs and larvae that are starting to mature, right? So if we open one of the colonies and we see eggs, and so we know, okay, this is the colony that kept the queen. For the next one, then we would just check to see if they started the new queen cells, and if they did, or they might had some from before, right? We can leave them undisturbed for about 2-3 weeks. I would say, to be on the safer side, check back in 2 weeks, just so that if there is no virgin queen that keeps them calm and busy, they don't make laying workers, right? In 2021, we had a lot of issues with these guys, with the laying workers. So this is like, again, basic how it would look after a split like this, either done from a single colony, from a colony with 1 brood boxes or 2 brood boxes, is we have a parent colony that has a queen, and then we end up with 2 colonies, but we don't know where the queen is until a few days later when we come back and inspect. So again, this method is good when we don't want to create the small split. When let's say it's June and then our hive is strong right now, and we're confident then that splitting it straight in 2 boxes, in 2 colonies, would make for 2 strong nests to go into the winter. The next splitting type would be for mating nooks. This is what we do a lot of every spring. This is what we fight with. So when splitting for mating nooks, usually we would use less bees. And it's like really considerably less bees. Sometimes the mating nooks are really tiny, like even the boxes, right? So 1.5 cups of bees is the recipe. An important thing for the mating nooks is that they need constant attention. Make sure that they have enough room, because they always collect nectar or we feed them. Also, the queen needs room to lay. They overcrowd sometimes in bursts, like very quickly, and they just go away if not timely supervised. The technique of splitting is the same. Either put 2 frames in a 2-frame mating nook, or just pour bees in a styrofoam box. But instead of adding a mated queen, we will just add a queen cell. And because we craft these queen cells, we know the timing. So we know in 2 days they will be hatching. After a few days, we will check to make sure that the queen has hatched. And oftentimes we will find them that for some reason they didn't. So we need to intervene quickly and place a new cell. Or if the queen has hatched, then from that point on, and we're not looking for the queen here, we're just checking literally just the queen cell. We don't want to bother them at this point. If the virgin queen is in there and we bother them, we have a high chance of her flying away. So we will just open the top, pick up the queen cell, look at the round hole that she's been hatching through. If the hole is on the bottom, not on the sides, then we just close it up and write down, and we'll come back in 2 weeks. So another type of split is when, say, we find a colony that it's full of bees. We have frames such as this one on the left side, lots of them. Last summer we had one where we counted for the record, it had 19 frames of brood. They were not all full like this one, but there were 19 frames of brood. So in anticipation of that colony, swarming, we split that into literally 4 splits. And then we had some brood left, right? So the added benefit of splitting for swarm prevention or splitting in general is that we will get a brood break. And in our experience, in our yards, it helps with controlling varroa numbers. And the way we count this is we treat the hives with oxalic either late November or December. And sometimes we intentionally postpone to December just so we make sure that there's no brood. And those colonies we split in May. And then when we count for mites, late June or even in July, we may see zero mites. And then in July, on the second count, we may start seeing mites coming in. So we prevent a swarm, and then also we help them with varroa, right? In our operation, beginning of May, we split all the colonies with 7 or more frames of brood. And this is to prevent the swarming, and also just because we sell so many Nooks, right? And we could repeat this process in 4 weeks if the number of frames is above 0. By that time, we should be in June. It's warmer. They're raising way more bees, more brood. And we repeat if needed. So splitting for swarm prevention technique is the same, right? We take 3 or 2, 3, 4 frames of brood, 1 frame of feed. And we can add either a mated queen to the new split or a queen cell, or in some cases, just allow them to raise a new queen. In our store, I recommend to the urban beekeepers that purchase equipment from us that every spring, the colonies that they have from the previous year, they split just to prevent the swarming. And even if they don't want to increase the number of colonies they have, they can later merge, like say August or beginning of September, they can just merge these colonies back. And then they will have a stronger colony going into the winter, and avoid troubles with the neighbors. I'm also going to talk a bit about the Doolittle split method. Now, this is like requires a bit of engineering and work, but it's a very precise splitting method that works well, especially like for us when we do batches of Nooks, right? So we prepare a box and a queen excluder for the new split. We open the colony number 1 that is going to be split. We find a few frames of capped brood, and this is important, brush all the bees off. So we brush all the bees, we make sure there's literally nothing on the frame other than brood. So this way we ensure that the queen stays in the colony, right? We put all these frames of brood with no bees in an empty box. Then we replace the frames that we took from the donor colony, close that up. The next step is to open a new strong colony. We're going to place the excluder on top of the frames. And on top of the excluder, we're going to place these frames of brood. So from one colony, we took the frames of brood. From the other colony, we're going to take a lot of bees. Both of these colonies will have now less bees. So we help them both in terms of like swarm prevention. So now we're going to collect bees on the frames of brood and then close this second colony. We're going to come back after 1 or 2 days. By now, the bees are familiar with, they discover that the frames of brood on top. They're familiar with it. They're tending, they're warming or ventilating the brood. So we're going to take that box off, place it on a bottom board, add frames if needed to make either the 10, 8, or whatever the number is, cover it up and move it to a new location. And at this point, we can add a caged mated queen. So because there's lots of cat brood, young bees are gonna hatch. They're more likely to accept the new queen. And yeah, so we basically kind of try to filter and walk with, create the split with just younger bees. So we don't have to worry about acceptance. That was kind of it. Thank you very much. If there's questions.
There's some in the chat, Alin. Would you like me to read them for you? Or
Just give me a quick second to go back and find. Yes, I have to stop share first. Alrighty. What does it mean if the hole is on the bottom compared to the side of the queen cell? So when working with the queen cells, say we drop a queen cell on top of the frames. If there is an existing queen or a virgin queen, like a mated or virgin queen, they will go and rip the cell on the side. Let me just try to show you. So assuming this is a queen cell, so an existing queen will rip it here, and through this it will sting the virgin queen to death so that she doesn't have competition. So if we see the cell that has been open on this side, then we know for sure that queen is not gonna, either she's dead or she's not gonna mate, right? If on the other hand we see a nice round hole right here at the bottom, and most of the times we would actually see the actual hatch still hanging, then we know that she cut that, helped by the bees or just by herself. She's in the hive, and then we're going to see her mated in, hopefully we're going to see her mated in 2 weeks. what do you do with the colonies, with the queens from the colonies that you merge? So in this case, one of them has to go away. Specifically, I was talking about a case where beekeepers in urban areas don't want to increase their numbers, but this is a solution where from one colony, they get like a strong one and then a weaker one that is a split. It may grow a bit to the end of the season, but then it's just merged to add bees to the cluster for the winter. And again, if you're in a dense urban area and you don't want more colonies, I think that's a good way to prevent swarming and have a strong nest for the winter.
I was asking how you dispatch the queen. I just think I'm just trying to find things that
Just
people
find the queen and then it's up to you.
maybe put her in a little bit of alcohol and make some queen perfume.
Yeah, that's a good option. I know Dan was a big fan of making or like getting pheromone this way, right? Dan Duma. How do you feel about splitting methods that involve forcing the colony to raise an emergency queen? It could work. I don't have a lot of experience with this. We do basically, that's how we raise our queen cells, but we try to distribute them to strong colonies so that they raise like big larvae. Splitting methods that involve forcing the colony to raise an emergency queen. So this is the walk-away split. It could result in a decent queen. I wouldn't say there's gonna be a weak queen. You can't guarantee that. But it gives them quite a while with no brood. So if the concern was, there's too many bees, then that's a good option for introducing this longer brood break, right? Because it will take time to build the queen cell, then she's going to mate and so on. She's going to lay. So about 3 weeks, there's no large number of eggs being laid. For a walkaway split, how long approximately until the new queen is laying? So if there is a queen cell already there, then it could be, say, 2 weeks, but the safer would be 3 weeks. So it would be, they make a new queen cell, 12 days till she's hatching, 6 more days till she gets sexually matured, 1 or 2 days for flight. So we're like past 2 weeks. And then we want her to lay a few days, the more the better, so she gets confident. So safest is 3 weeks, but I would inspect that after 2 weeks, because if I don't see signs of a queen, even a virgin one, then I don't want them to get like a laying worker, right? So I would say check after 2 weeks. But if you see the queen, allow her 1 more week to get mated and establish herself as the laying queen there. Have you experimented with double screened boards for merging weak colonies or making splits? Not really. I'm having issues merging colonies myself. We're still trying to gauge what's the number of layers of newspaper. But double screen, no, for sure, not. Is your standard method making splits, doing it in the same yard? Because we have multiple yards, we definitely move them away. And in Northumberland, we even have a yard. It's an organic farm that we take care of their 2 hives, and they allow us to drop Nooks there just for reorientation. So it's about 6 kilometers away from us. We make the Nooks. In the evening, we drop it on their yard. After 2-3 days, we pick them up and we're good to go. And in the other yards, we just make the Nooks and always relocate in the same evening. When we go home, we take the Nooks with us. For the case where we would keep it in the same location, I would prefer that the new Nook stays in the place where the old hive was, and the hive goes away, so that it gets a few of the foragers to add up to the numbers. But again, we prefer moving them. It's safer. Also, once you make a split, in the case when there's a new a mated queen in a cage, feeding the splits helps a lot in them accepting the new queen.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions, or have all of your questions been answered? Nope. Okay, thank you, Alin, for that presentation.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Michelle, did you want to talk about your...
Yeah, so I have two items. One of them I'm going to call housekeeping, and the other one is just a friendly suggestion. So my housekeeping item is on the coordinating committee of the UTBA. We have a couple of vacant positions. And one of them is the position that handles our incoming email. And we don't get very much email, especially during COVID, but it is going to start ramping up. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I've had a number of members contacting me, telling me this year that they would like to make sure that if the UTBA receives calls about swarms, that they are, that they get the information so they can go out and pick up swarms. So in order to do that, the UTBA has a list of their members who are ready to go get swarms. And the list is divided basically into kind of like east-west, kind of north-south. And the requirement to be on the list is just simply that you have a little bit of beekeeping experience, and that you understand that you're representing the UTBA, and that you have some mitigation strategies to make sure that, people who are there watching you, stand back, that they understand what's going on, because it's a bit of a PR thing as well as catching a swarm. But in order to do this, we need somebody who can respond to emails, potentially get phone calls, and then can take those calls and disseminate them out to the list of volunteers. So it has to be somebody that's on social media all the time, or at least available to to receive incoming texts, Facebook messages on our page, so that they can act in a prompt manner, because we like to make sure that the swarms get attention within, ideally an hour, if not, a couple. So if any people here feel that that's something that they could help us out with, we would really appreciate it, because we have gone a little bit without this position on the board. So please just send me a message, and I can explain it to you further, and you can make sure that you can be ready for this, because it is a job. You have to be on the ball. It's not something where you can only check your email once a day kind of thing. The other thing that I wanted to suggest is a friendly reminder that a lot of our new beekeepers don't have any experience, and we haven't met in person. So there's a lot of people out there who really would like to get either some hands-on experience, or to get out to watch some beekeepers, just so that they can understand what's going on. So if you are in a position where you would feel comfortable letting some brand new beekeepers shadow you, watch you do some inspections, I encourage you to post that information on our Facebook page. I'm not talking about posting your name, your address or your phone number or anything, but what I am talking about is just saying, in 24 hours, I live in the east end of the city and I'm going to be doing some inspections. If anybody's interested in coming over to watch or to shadow me, please send me a direct message. And that way you can evaluate any of the responses or whatever we have. I have found that when we collaborate together, we create a better community. I know that I am a moderator of a number of Facebook groups, and this is something that we're doing in the Ontario Women's Beekeeping Association, is we're creating an arrangement or just a collaboration where beekeepers have the opportunity to get out, meet other beekeepers, because finally we can be in person, but also get a little hands-on experience and kind of network, at least until the UTBA can meet in person. Fingers crossed, that'll be a September thing. So you can look for my posts on the page. I'll always be happy to have a couple of people come over to my yard and watch me do any work. And that is everything that I had to say.
Okay, thank you very much. We are coming back for our final meeting before our summer break next month in June. We'll have Glynis back with us talking about bee viruses and how to deal with them. And we will post about our main speaker as soon as that is finalized. Happy beekeeping. Hope you all have a great time getting into your hives over the next little while. The weather looks like it's looking up finally. And maybe we can have a little chat at the end of next meeting and just see how everybody's doing. But we will see you back in June. And Michelle, Lynn volunteered to do, I think, your emails. And thank you very, very much for attending. We'll see you in June.
Bye. Have a good night.
Good night.
Hey, everyone.
Good night.